So thanks for coming. How many of you were here back in 2019 when we talked about this project? Great. How many of you have been to the restoration project by boat, car? Okay. I know I kayaked with some women a few years ago. Did I kayak with you all? Yeah, that was fun. Anne, I remember you coordinated that. I think it was that same summer, pre-COVID. So this was my home for about 4 years. I took this picture the other night when I started doing monitoring at about 5 o'clock at night, and the sun was absolutely beautiful. I was trying to multitask and fit a little bit more in during the day. This is one of my photo stations, and it was just a beautiful night on the west side of the Quonnie sediment placement project. So, Save the Bay, we've been involved, I work at Save the Bay, and I've been working on salt marsh restoration projects in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts for about 25 years. We started in 1996 doing habitat restoration work, and back around about just a little over a decade ago, we started noticing significant degradation of salt marshes throughout the region. And we decided to work collectively with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Resources Management Council, folks from the EPA Atlantic Ecology Division, which is housed at the graduate over in Narragansett near the Graduate School of Oceanography, to try a new restoration approach, which literally meant filling a salt marsh and elevating the salt marsh. And one of the first projects that was done was at Satchuas Marsh over in Middletown. This was on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge. They actually brought in material sand from a upland source and from a boat ramp project, and placed sand on an old degraded marsh that had been a former landfill to elevate the salt marsh. And here you can see it revegetating. And then this is the Narrow River, again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife property, right? If you ever are where the old kayak center, or not kayak center, kayak, Narrow River Kayaks used to rent kayaks right by Middlebridge, you can see this sediment placement project. And then there are the two sites that I've been working on with CRMC as well. Quonnie, or Ninigret, which we did in 2017, and then the Quonnie project in 2018-19. So we started at Satchuas in 16, Narrow River and Ninigret in 2017, and then we paused a couple years and did a similar project at Quonnie. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about both projects because I look at the Quonnie and the Ninigret project very similarly. They're both salt marshes in salt ponds that have man-made breachways, so some similarities there. Those breachways needed to be dredged, so there was some community benefit with all the folks who like to boat in and out of the breachways. There's also some water quality benefits, and the marshes were experiencing similar levels of degradation. So we received funding for the Ninigret project from Department of Interior through funds post-Hurricane Sandy. And CRMC, our Coastal Resources Management Council, was the lead agency receiving those funds. And then Save the Bay, we worked as like a subcontractor for CRMC, doing the monitoring, helping with the design, assessment, and what we call restoring hydrology after that sediment was placed on the marsh. So they're not cheap projects, and you can see it went up in cost. I can't even imagine what the cost would be like today, based upon everything else. Costs like housing and materials, equipment. I'd be very interested to see what quotes would come back at today if we were to do one of these projects. So the Quonnie project was a little bigger because we were working on both sides of the breachway. Ninigret, we just worked on on the west side of the breachway. So if any of you have gone down Charlestown Town Beach Road, you can see the DEM parking lot and boat launch. And this is a salt marsh area that had seen some significant degradation. The breachway, the ocean's just to the south. the breachway dredging occurred basically from the boat ramp up into the salt pond. And if any of you have boated into Ninigret, it's a much more circuitous breachway and a lot of shoaling, much more so than the Quonnie breachway. And these were the conditions beforehand, a lot of what I call standing water, impounded water on the marsh platform. So the marsh platform is just the flat area of the salt marsh where farmers used to hay the marsh grasses. Sometimes they would actually bring cattle out to graze. We worked with the Charlestown Land Trust to get a piece of the marsh donated by the Gavitt family back before we did the Quonnie project. And Mr. Gavitt was saying he was kind of surprised that his grandfather owned this land, but he had cattle. Even though he lived inland, he owned a piece of marsh to get hay for his cattle. And here's an example of the marsh vegetation pretty much dying off. If any of you have read about the salt marsh sparrow, it's a little nondescript bird. It only nests on salt marsh grasses, on the salt marsh. This little dark green little donut of vegetation is high marsh grass. That's what it likes to nest in. Doesn't look like the greatest nesting habitat there. So that's why it's in such peril, is because this is not uncommon in Rhode Island, southeastern New England, or throughout the range of the salt marsh sparrow from about mid-Atlantic up to Maine. So this was the Ninigret project. For those of you who saw this presentation, there's going to be some similar slides. Both were done by a contractor out of Wisconsin. They think Rhode Island's balmy in December and January. Because of dredging restrictions, you can't dredge when it's flounder spawning season. So the dredge window was, I think, from maybe early November to January 31st. And the contractor pretty much mobilized right after Thanksgiving, took a break at Christmas, and left by January 31st for both projects. And they were working 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they both had 2 dredges with a cutter head, which you can see in the bottom left. And then it was pumped via hydraulic dredging through this 8-inch pipe. And this slurry of sand, shell, and water was discharged onto the marsh platform to elevate it so it could basically revegetate and keep pace with sea level rise. So this is a little fuzzy. This was one of some drone imagery, not as good as yours, Bob, from Brennan right after they placed the sediment at Ninigret. And you could see all those lines. That's their bulldozers moving. They spread it around with low ground pressure bulldozers. And then we showed up at this time of year, which is probably February. And my colleague Dave Prescott, who no longer works at Save the Bay, he and I were out there one day, and there were winds, I think they were like 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts. And it was just like watching the Sahara Desert, this sand that we just pumped up onto the marsh. And we hadn't thought about sand stabilization. This was all new to all of us practitioners. And we immediately started to hustle and grab anything that we could find, and that was a lot of dead vegetation from Hurricane Sandy, like bayberry bushes, that we were kind of creating windbreaks. And then we planted, with some Boy Scouts and with a bunch of hardy interns, beach grass that first year. We planted, I forget how many, 30,000 plants or so to stabilize the sand. And what was amazing, this habitat that we're creating initially after the sand's been placed, it looks just like the Quonnie overwash after Hurricane Sandy, or the multiple storms that we had prior to Hurricane Sandy that created that nice bare area. And who shows up in those nice bare areas to nest? Who loves that bare sand? Piping plovers, and what's the other bird that's even, at least terns, even more aggressive. And this little, I don't know if you can see it, here's one of our tiny little branch, and there are two little piping plovers seeking refuge right where the sand was getting caught. And that was in March of 2017 when we first started that project. So we learned a lot at these sites. Just because I revised this presentation from a presentation I did earlier this summer with a group from New Jersey called the Beneficial Use Learning Exchange Network. And so they do a lot of dredging down in Jersey because they have the Intercoastal Waterway, and they're trying to beneficially use this sediment. And they wanted to learn. I've been involved with this learning exchange to share information about what we've been doing in New England. Rhode Island was the first state to do any of these sediment placement projects. Connecticut's now done a couple. So we're trying to learn from New Jersey as well as share information. And so I'm trying to explain to people that the sediment placement is just step one. You get the sediment on the marsh, but then it looks like this. And as I showed you, you got to stabilize the sand. You have to restore hydrology. You don't want to just dump a bunch of sand on the marsh and then leave it. What would happen, Joan, we were talking about Phragmites earlier, some of that water is fresh water that was impounded at the upper edge of the marsh. So if we hadn't given a path for that fresh water to drain out, that would have been inundated with Phragmites. So we did a lot of more fine-tuned grading with this small piece of low ground pressure excavator. This is owned by DEM's mosquito abatement program, and we rent it for these projects. And it has very low ground pressure, so it's great for working in salt marshes. And we restored hydrology, creating creeks. We did a lot of hand digging. We did a lot of initial grading. Everything along the lower edge of the marsh was very much like quicksand because there was water trapped in it. So we graded it out. We used, along the lower edge of the marsh, we used the existing marsh vegetation, kind of like a silt fence, just like to control the sediment from just flowing into the pond. But we still needed to grade into it. And all of these lessons we applied to the Quonnie project that we did 2 years later. We learned that you dig a creek, and just like your kids or grandkids digging a little creek along the shore, it's going to fill in with the first rainstorm or the first big tide, because that sand is mobile. So we had to do a lot of grading of the banks, the creeks that we dug along the edges of those creeks to make a nice stable slope. So there was a lot of earth moving that we did those first 2 years by hand and with that small low ground pressure excavator. At Ninigret, we did 2 significant planting years. The yellow was the beach grass that I mentioned, which was originally not even planned. We planted beach grass again in those early months for sand stabilization. And then the green vegetation is a variety of salt marsh plants. I was just out there last week, and this is 3 pictures, same angle, and you can see how the vegetation has really come in. Disticus is a high marsh, a grass that grows again on that marsh platform that the salt marsh sparrows would nest in. So we've seen a lot of revegetation. We probably didn't need to plant as much as we did. We learned that, and we didn't do as much planting at Quonnie. We found planting, this was right after the first year. These are not happy-looking plants. These lower elevation areas are you have very high salinity levels, so the plants get stressed and die off. So we learned to wait to introduce plants in those lower elevation areas, which is kind of, you would think that with less sediment, maybe the vegetation would grow through, but actually those are the areas that become super salty and stress the plants. And we found the least amount of colonization in those lower elevation where we put less sand, and greater colonization where we put more sand. And again, these hypersaline areas, this is the only graph or chart I'm going to share. The ocean is 30 to 32 parts per thousand. Quonnie Pond is very salty. It's probably 28 to 32 parts per thousand. You see these really the red and the oranges are very salty, 45 to 60 parts per thousand. And the plants just can't tolerate that level of salinity. So that's why we were there. Here's an example. You can see how degraded the area looks, kind of that anoxic black soil. And then we dug a little channel to give that salt water a path out, and we have seen revegetation there. But again, it's slow in those lower elevation areas. And we've done tons of maintenance out there. As I said, sand moves, and it's going to move with every rainstorm. It moves with wind. And so we dug these creeks, and then we had to come back and do more and continue to tweak the sites as time went on. We found planting along the edges of those creeks helped stabilize those banks. And you can see kind of a before and after, upper and lower. And then one of the challenges with the Ninigret project, the contractor went a little higher elevation, and so we certainly have more Phragmites out there. We were talking about Phragmites earlier. So you get to a certain elevation along the edge of a salt marsh, and you're going to get the Phragmites is present in these habitats. And so one of the ways we've controlled it is trying to address that fresh water that's sitting on the marsh surface and give it a path out and doing additional grading. But it is a challenge if you're trying to create an area for the salt marsh. In these, what we call the salt ponds have very limited tidal range, so the vegetation grows in a very limited area. So if you just go a little bit too high, you could be in a zone that could support Phragmites if you have a freshwater source like groundwater. And here's all the stuff we did out there. We graded those little yellow patches. We dug creeks, the blue areas that were kind of wide, to give a path for the salt water to come in, and then the fresh water from the back barrier beach to drain out. And then we did a heck of a lot of hand digging as well. And then we come back in the winter and see it looked like someone had been clamming, like for soft shell clams, along our creeks. And I had seen this up in Narragansett Bay. Geese, when the tide is up, they do not do this with their beaks. They wait for the tide to get up, and it has to be a pretty good tide, more of a moon tide. And then in the fall, they dig with their feet, and they expose the Spartina alterniflora, which is the grass that gets flooded twice a day. So it's the most salt-tolerant grass. All the nutrients are in the roots in the fall as the vegetation's dying off. And that's where the geese are digging up the plants to eat the roots. They're not nipping the fresh growth. You'll see them doing that in June and July, but they're not killing the plants by doing that. They kill the plants when they do this. So this is another impact to our marshes throughout the region, and you just have to plan for the fact that there will be predation. And look at, you can see, I showed you a picture. We planted along the creeks to stabilize the slopes, and then the geese floated in and dug up all our plants. So, so if anyone has a bird dog that they want to lend us, please. And when I first got out there at Ninigret, and I saw how high some of the elevation areas, some of the areas were higher than we had predicted, I was a little stressed, to say the least. And but these projects, we're not going to be placing sand and elevating all our salt marshes around this region. There isn't enough sand, there isn't enough money. But if we can create some higher elevation areas so that these salt marshes have a place to migrate as sea level continues to rise, that's what the Ninigret site is. You can see that kind of golden grass, that's beach grass. Of course, marsh vegetation is not growing along with beach grass or dune grass, but that could be where a salt marsh in 20, 30 years could be. And we went out there one day in November, and these two upper pictures were taken during a it was equivalent to a 6-foot tide in Newport, or 2 feet of sea level rise. So a foot higher than a king tide, one of our highest tides of the year. And that whole marsh area, except the highest elevation areas, was flooded. So when I look at these projects, I think of not just enhancing the health of the marsh today, but also looking for a place for the marsh to go in the future. And this is, again, Ninigret from just last week. Some of those beach grass areas that we planted back in 2017 are now, does anyone know what this shrub is here? Has a wonderful smell. Joan might have it in her garden. Bayberry. Yep. So bayberry, we did not plant any bayberry out there. This all came by seed. So that's a higher elevation area. So this zone is basically what I would call a marsh migration zone, where the marsh could migrate under future sea level rise scenarios. So back to Quonnie. So I should have taken some pictures from the pre-Quonnie breachway. I just think it's so interesting. When we think of Quonnie, this marsh here has been so impacted. We put a man-made breachway through it, and we filled this. All of this is fill, and this whole area is fill. These two marshes used to connect together, and you can kind of see there's a creek here, this creek that just dead ends. That actually connected to the other side. When you look at the 1939 or 56 aerial imagery, and I apologize that I didn't grab an image, it's really fascinating to see how the two sides were connected. And it explains a lot of how these marshes were impacted when the breachway went in. But I think, and then you had significant ditching that was done probably here for mosquito abatement. Many of our marshes, and this is something that I'm really interested in looking at from your archives, our marshes in the salt ponds, and especially in Narragansett Bay, there was a lot of agricultural activity starting in the 1600s. And the farmers back then were they had livestock. There was forests everywhere. The only place that there were natural grasslands were salt marshes. So they were doing everything they could to try to manipulate the marsh to allow it to grow vegetation that would be beneficial for hay and crops. And so they created these very shallow embankments to prevent the tide from coming in, and they created ditches, not as significant as these ditches, but to give a path for the fresh water out. And we're finding these embankments all over salt marshes today. And I think it's really interesting seeing, looking at the pictures here, that, was it Burdick who brought his cattle and livestock down from Bradford down to Quonnie in the summertime, and how the coastal areas were used. And like Mr. Gavitt's grandfather, the Gavitt parcel was right in here. And I'll show you some pictures of what that Gavitt parcel looks like today. That was being used to hay. They were haying the marsh for centuries. So this site, we dredged from basically the boat ramp out into the pond to almost the northernmost buoy. This is part of the Gavitt property. I think this image, this lower left, you can imagine you wouldn't be getting much salt marsh hay from these images, from these sites today. The marsh was very degraded. When you have standing water like this on a salt marsh, you get these fine algal mats. It's really, it's like a filamentous green algae. And I used to think it was coming from nutrients, which when you see algae, you can assume nutrients from the land, from stormwater, from septic systems. When it's sitting on the marsh surface like that, it's often coming from the degrading peat as the marsh sinks. As water sits on the marsh, the vegetation dies and the marsh literally sinks. And that decomposing peat is enough to create an algal bloom like that. I had a colleague that did a study of the isotopes, the nitrogen isotopes, and found that it was the decaying peat that was fueling the algae, not human sources, which is fascinating. So a pretty degraded site. I like this picture, shows the west side, a 2001 image. You notice there are ditches just to the west and south of that little pond area. Look at that area. Sorry, I don't have a pointer. And you can see it goes from, it went from vegetated to it's all open water. And that's what it looked like before we put the sediment on. So just again, you can see that the gray is vegetation in 2001. By 2018, it was open water. So when we talk about marshes drowning in place, we were seeing it at Quonnie Pond. And that's the on-the-ground image. And then Bob took these pictures, and this wasn't the December 23rd storm. I think this was just a big king tide or a big storm tide in January based upon the dates. And you can see the entire sediment placement area was covered with, pretty much most of the area was covered with water with 2 feet of sea level rise. You'll see a little area on the west that is exposed, and a little area up against the breachway, the upland that is exposed, is above that 2-foot elevation. So again, same contractor came back from Wisconsin. This time, they didn't stay. What's the hotel up the street with the woman's name up in Charlestown? It's by.
Ann's?
Yes, Phil and Ann's. They stayed at Phil and Ann's in 2017. 2019, they got an Airbnb, and so they knew they got to know Rhode Island. They got their Airbnb, and they did the exact same thing. What was really interesting, this is on the west side. You can see the gulls in the background. This is January, and I don't know if any of you are into birding, but there were dunlin feeding, which is a little winter shorebird that we get here, and they're feeding on the whatever was getting dug up. So there was, the gulls were feeding on the churned up mussels and clams, but the dunlin were feeding on smaller things. It was kind of cool. It was like a little buffet. So this was immediately post placement, after I had gotten there with our low ground pressure excavator. So any of these like creek features you can see we installed. They finished in January. We started working probably mid-February. And then we learned from Ninigret, manage the sand. So we put out dune fencing. You can see these lines. We put dune fencing on the northern part and also here. And that we only planted along the northern area with beach grass, and you can see the beach grass we planted along the spit. That was a component that I was very excited our partners liked. If you go back to the original aerial imagery, I don't know if you remember how low that spit was. You couldn't have a towel or a chair on that little spit, pull a kayak up. It was so low. There was just a very little dry ground. And because there was so much material that needed to be dredged, we were looking for an alternative location other than just a salt marsh. And I suggested, even though this was funded by NOAA and they are interested in restoring habitats, they also supported restoring horseshoe crab spawning habitat, which if you go out, and I see Peter here, on a May or June evening, it is, or daytime, it's loaded with horseshoe crabs and red knots, and actually ruddy turnstones. I've only seen one red knot, and willets that are feeding on the eggs, as well as for public access enhancement. So here you can see that little eroding spit, and then if any of you have been down there, it's now, we planted all that beach grass, and we put the fence up so that discouraging people from going into the sediment placement area, and it gave the public a place to go as well. Because that first year, it looked like just a huge beach that we had created over here. And we had people, walking their dogs, and I get it. They just thought this was a great new access site, but at least we provided designated access on that barrier spit. So here's 2019, and you could start to see some revegetation by 21. We go out and we monitor. I even got my husband out here one day. He was not the happy. I've had my husband, during COVID, I had no interns. I had my kids kicking and screaming, taking data for helping me plant. And it was definitely an all hands on deck because we also had COVID in the mix on this one. But similar grading, excavating creeks, applying all these lessons learned that we learned from Ninigret and Narrow River. Here's that dune that has formed in the middle of the marsh on the west side. We just put fencing up, and look at how much sand moved in there. I forget when that picture was taken. That was probably 21. And the dune width was almost 30 feet wide, and this is what it looks like today. So proactive sand stabilization is really important for these projects. And there have been piping plovers nesting on that western side, which is great because there aren't many people over there. We did planting in 2019, and then we've done some sporadic planting with students in our, we have a program, these small little salt marsh grasses, they grow, they collect the seed in the fall, and then they grow the Spartina seed in their classroom, and then they plant it in the spring. So we've been doing that with Cheraho and East Providence High School, a few different high schools for the last 3 years. And so it's a great way to get kids directly involved in these restoration projects. And then this is the suite of activities that we've been doing at Quonnie. All the green areas are the salt marsh planting areas. The yellow is what we planted with beach grass. And then the red and the yellow, those are the creeks, or the more shallow, what I call runnels or shallow channels in yellow that we dug by hand. And it was just, as I was mentioning, I was just out there. I'm going to skip through this. This again, just showing how the sand moves. We learned, one thing we do is on these projects, we learn to take chunks of peat that we dig up and create these little check dams to hold that sand back. You can see that we're installing them there in these little side channels, and that helped to keep the sand from filling in our main creeks. And one of the reasons why we want these creeks to remain open is they're draining that fresh water from the upland edge and giving salt water a path up into the salt marsh. And we've learned that you don't have to do a lot of planting. Recolonization is going to happen. Any place we created a depression, this was a drainage feature that we created, and it filled in all of those plants are succulents like pickleweeds and another one called sueda. And that's just the seed flows into these depressions. So wherever you have a depression, you see these beautiful ribbons of green. And then in the upper part of the marsh, this is the upper edge, where the tide line, the big moon tides, drop the beach grass and the marsh grass, the rack. That is also seed. So we've seen tons of revegetation along the upper edge, as well as in any of these little depressions. And then this was a picture that Bob just took last week. And again, those ribbons of green, you can kind of see wherever those little depressions are, we're getting revegetation. This is looking from the barrier spit south. And then this upper edge, this all came in on its own. I can pick out our little planting areas. They're a little higher in elevation because they captured sand. But it's pretty cool to see. These images are really helpful, Bob. And then this is on the west side, where we haven't had as much revegetation It's coming in more slowly. That upper corner is much higher in elevation. That's where the piping plovers have nested. And as I mentioned, since these are new projects, we're monitoring everything as much as we can. Save the Bay's been doing vegetation and salinity. My colleague was just out doing salt marsh sparrow surveys this past year, and we've just done what we call point counts looking for salt marsh sparrows. This year, they put up mist nets, and went out with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They have the permit to set up the nets, and we caught one female. And it's the funniest thing. We were out there at 5:30 in the morning, and we start running across the marsh to try to get these birds into the nets. And I'm thinking, why am I not going to step on a poor bird nest? And it ended up that they found a salt marsh sparrow nest in one of the areas that we planted in 2019. So if any of you volunteered with me, we planted an area that created a salt marsh sparrow nest 4 years later. And then at Ninigret, I think we had 5 salt marsh sparrow nests this year and a few seaside sparrows. And they're another bird that isn't as vulnerable, but pretty vulnerable. So that was exciting. And most recently, we've also been looking at gas flux measurements, which is basically marshes can sequester or take in carbon. And how do these restoration projects affect that carbon sequestration process? So we're doing some a little more intense monitoring. And some of the easiest monitoring is photo stations. And this is one of my photo stations at Ninigret, showing immediately before, right after, the first couple growing seasons, and then this is last week. And again, you can see the Phragmites all along the upper edge. So basically, there is Phragmites out there for sure, especially along where the back barrier marsh where there's that fresh water. But other than a few spots, most of that was just revegetation. And then this is Quonnie on the west side, that area that I was showing you that had pretty much drowned in place. So there it is, all open water with a few little tuffets of Spartina grasses. And then right during placement, August, and then you could start to see this this was the other night, this black, it's kind of that fine muck, organic matter that's beginning to build up. And again, we didn't do any planting on that side, so it's kind of cool to see a more typical marsh sediment or peat developing over the sand. And then this was at Ninigret, and that little red flag was where the salt marsh sparrow nested. And they like to create a little dome over their nest, so when the marsh does flood, that the eggs will rise and they won't float out of the nest. We've also found that they like this little shrub called high tide bush. And so if there are actually fledglings in the nest, they can actually climb up the high tide bush. And a colleague up in Warren is monitoring, has done 5 years of monitoring of salt marsh sparrows. And it's the first site that they now have published data to show that salt marsh sparrows are using this high tide bush as the fledglings are using it as a technique to get above the tide. So that had chicks, and there's a salt marsh sparrow. It's a beautiful little bird. It does not like to fly. So if you are out on the marsh and you see this bird like dart down and then you don't see it again, that's a salt marsh sparrow. The song sparrow will like go out, sit on something high, and then zip back to a shrub and wants to be seen. But the salt marsh sparrow will literally fly like down in the creeks below the marsh grasses, and it will run through the grasses. So you often don't see it. So it is a harder bird to try to capture in those nets as well. And then this was a man I met one morning when I was out at Quonnie. There are so many birders out at Quonnie now, which is kind of fun. And he shared with me some of, this was just the first summer, it's because of these exposed areas of sand, as the sites are revegetating, they become great migratory stopover places for shorebirds. As I mentioned, the higher elevation areas become nesting areas for piping plovers, as well as least terns. The oyster catchers haven't nested here. They nest out over on Sand Point is it Sandy Point? Is that what the island is in Little Narragansett Bay? I think that's what it's called. That's where the oyster catchers are. But laughing gulls, semi-palmateds, dunlin, ruddy turnstones, yellow legs, of course willets. Willets are all over the place. And then another feature is, as Peter knows, these are the tracks of the horseshoe crabs. You can kind of see the lines in the creek. And they use those creeks just like they used to use those ditches. You used to find lots of them in the ditches. And they spawn along the edges of that barrier spit that we created. One downside of this project, they also spawn on the area that we are targeting for salt marsh. And because they end up getting too high on the marsh, there isn't a nice kind of slope like a beach. It's just flat. So they get up and they sometimes strand themselves. So we've gone out. Peter, I don't know how many you rescued this summer, but we try to go out after the big moon tide and actually carry them back down, because they don't know to turn around, because of course they usually don't lay their eggs in a salt marsh. They lay their eggs in sandy material, and that's what we put on the marsh. But we have a pretty healthy horseshoe crab population. And the other cool thing is the seaside goldenrod. That we did plant some. It's come back like gangbusters at both sites. And if you go out from like October even into November, the migrating monarchs, it's the only plant around that's still blooming. And they are feeding on the nectar of the goldenrod before their migration. And of course, as you know, I just saw them just this weekend. They're beginning to move south and fly along the barrier beaches. So lots of additional benefits other than some of like the target species that we were focusing on being the salt marsh sparrow. And then just one last thing, I've also been working with the Charlestown Land Trust over the last several years. This is the marsh just to the south and east of the sediment placement project. So West Beach Road is down here. This was probably an old breachway at some point. And so because we couldn't put sand everywhere on these marshes, we've been doing work by hand, digging these shallow creeks or runnels that I described to address this degraded condition on the marsh platform. And here's my little restoration plan. And then here's some images showing when you provide a pathway for that water to drain off the marsh, you get revegetation, even in a site that is so low. This is a really low elevation marsh here. So if you're ever interested in getting boots on and working with me on a salt marsh, this is what I get to do on my days I'm not in the sediment, on the sediment placement sites. And then here's some of our partners, our funding partners, as well as basically every agency you can think of we work with. And that's my son on a sick day with the Red Sox cap, and he's going to college on Friday. So that was Ninigret. So it gives you an idea how long we've been working on these projects. But thank you. I'm so glad we had a good turnout tonight. And do you have any questions for me?